Now by Joel Rubin. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Obama administration for legislative affairs, and he's also a Democratic candidate for Congress in Maryland. So, Joel, good to see you. I want to start a little bit of where Kevin left off. What do you make of the administration's change in language and tone towards Israel, in particular Secretary of State Antony Blinken's comments saying that too many Palestinians in Gaza, too many civilians, I should say, are being killed?
Yeah, Omar, it's great to be with you. And this language is not exactly different from the beginning either. President Biden has consistently called for there to be protection for civilians. And I think what Secretary Blinken pointed out yesterday is that this is at the top of the administration's concerns. But, you know, the administration has been very clear that it supports Israel's right to defend itself. It supports Israel's right to root out Hamas from Gaza. And so I don't think these two ideas are at odds with each other. And we see that in the way the Biden team is talking about it. They're talking about the need for an end state, a process for a two-state solution, the idea that the civilians are not to be blamed for Hamas's actions. So all of that's coming together, but clearly with the secretary saying it vocally yesterday, the administration is trying to make sure that that message gets out to audiences abroad, to the Arab world and the Muslim world in particular.
Of course, especially as many leaders in the Arab and Islamic world have been meeting over the course of the past 24 hours. And along some of what you were mentioning before, the president has been pushing Israel to expand humanitarian pauses in the war. But they've been reluctant to call for a ceasefire outright. Do you support that policy?
Yeah, I do support the policy as it's being executed right now. I think calling for a ceasefire by the United States has the potential to undermine what Israel is engaged in right now, which is truly rooting out Hamas fighters. And that does not mean that Israel should not take care regarding its targeting, and it does need to take care. And I think that's why you see Secretary Blinken talking about civilian casualties. But look, there are hostages right now that are Israeli hostages that are still sitting in tunnels in Gaza that Hamas has not let go, despite multiple diplomatic efforts. Israel needs to continue to protect its southern border. There are children hostages, nearly 20 of them, sitting underneath Gaza and being used as ransom. So what's the end state for Hamas? Hamas is clearly sending rockets into Tel Aviv as well, holding the hostages, preventing Palestinians from getting to safer zones. And so that's why a ceasefire right now would be problematic until there is a real definitive military victory against Hamas, in particular in the northern part of Gaza.
And obviously, words are being very closely monitored in every public statement that goes out. And so pause versus ceasefire. Right. I mean, I think just from a layman's term standpoint, are pauses not essentially small ceasefires that would have to be agreed on by both sides in a sense? I mean, is there a diplomatic difference in the terms here?
Yeah. Look, Omar, you're really bringing up the core point here is that first there was a ceasefire up until October 6th, and then Hamas broke it and invaded southern Israel. And a ceasefire also implies that both sides participate. And Hamas has not been actively pursuing a diplomatic process or a peaceful process with Israel. So these pauses are designed to enable humanitarian assistance to get in, to ensure that the Palestinian civilians are moved out of harm's way. But once a ceasefire, if that were to be called and enacted, that would create a new permanent de facto baseline. It would not be something that can be moved into and out of like these pauses. But Hamas is not hitting the ceasefire button. They are fighting, and they are fighting in manners that, as you saw in the earlier reporting, are putting Palestinian lives at risk. And so a ceasefire right now would be further problematic and would not prevent Hamas from continuing in its murderous ways as it's doing right now.
Now, obviously, you know, the country of Israel, but obviously the Israeli Defense Forces have a mission in trying to eradicate Hamas, as they have said many times. But we've also seen protests in places across the world over the civilian casualties and for some of the Palestinians. Do you worry at all that the global and even U.S. support for Israel will erode if the civilian death toll continues to rise, and if there's a perception that Israel isn't doing enough to avoid some of those casualties?
Yeah, you know, Omar, I'm very worried about that. And what pains me is watching what's happening here in the United States and the anti-Semitic language that's being used about Israel, the tearing down of posters of kidnapped Israelis, boycotting of Jewish establishments. This sort of language and the political environment here is getting very toxic very quickly, and that does put pressure, of course, on our government. But the pressure globally is one that it does want to see a stop to the violence. We all do. But if you have a terrorist state living at your southern border that continues to fire rockets, kidnaps your people, and keeps them as ransom, at a certain point one has to say, and including the Arab League, they need to say, this is what we're going to do to stop Hamas from going further and massacring Israelis. I think it's worth noting that Syria was at this meeting too. Hafez Assad, he killed several 100,000 of his own people, and then he was welcomed to this meeting, and that's just the height of hypocrisy. So what is the solution to stop Hamas from invading southern Israel and preventing it from continuing to have a massacre ideology at its core? That has to be part of this conversation.
And of course, in all of this not happening in a vacuum, as you mentioned, that Arab League summit included the leaders of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Syria as well. We got to leave it there, but Joel Rubin, thank you as always.
Thanks, Amar.